All right, here we go on Thursday. Welcome to Halitics. I'm Hal Ginsberg. So glad to have this opportunity to speak to you. And again, I say it every show, please. I really want to hear from you if you're watching me live. It's so much more fun. It's more exciting. It's more interesting if we have a back and forth, if we have a dialogue, if we have a discussion. And that is with you, really, with you. And I love having Arlen on, but I like doing programs myself too, because then I get to focus on the topics that are of most importance to me, that I think are most relevant. And I want your feedback on those very, what I believe to be critically important topics. One of the issues, boy, we're having trouble with today's tech. I don't know what the heck's going on. There's always something else going wrong, obviously. But there it is. Yeah, we got the subscribe button. So please do like, please do subscribe. You can see the headline's pretty clear. Despicable. New York Times blames Gazans for being buried in mass graves. And you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. The story right now that's coming out of Gaza is as gruesome as any we've seen, we've heard since the onslaught by Israel in reprisal, responding to the October 7 attack by Hamas. And it is really gruesome. 4 mass graves now discovered, and media doing a pretty good job. Certainly Al Jazeera. We'll hear from Al Jazeera in just a moment to tell us what's going on, what exactly Israel's done, what kind of, I would say, certainly war crime shades of the Holocaust that we're seeing. The New York Times not doing good work, not at all. In fact, more in the nature of a cover-up than anything else. But we'll get to that. Let's now get to the facts on the ground. This is current. This is what Al Jazeera is reporting. And this is very consistent with what the UN is reporting and what other media outlets are telling us as well. But Al Jazeera are doing an outstanding job. So I think they should get pride of place when it comes to reportage on this incredibly important story, the moral crisis of our time.
We're going to begin in Gaza, where the Palestinian Civil Defense Team says evidence from mass graves in the grounds of Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis shows the Israeli army carried out summary executions. 392 bodies have been recovered in mass graves across Gaza, but they've not been able to identify 267 of them, and at least 20 people may have been buried alive at the medical complex. Children were also among the bodies recovered. The team...
I'm just going to stop it there for a second. So just the facts as reported there, 392 bodies recovered, 200 unidentified, children in that mass grave there outside the hospital. I think is it Al Shifa or Nasser Hospital, both of them, maybe, combined children, patients as well in the mass graves.
Is accusing Israel of committing crimes against humanity. Meanwhile, international pressure is mounting on Israel after the discovery of the mass graves. U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan says Washington wants answers. The White House says reports of mass graves in Gaza...
And I just stop it there for a sec because I'm going to move on. I don't want to play the entire clip, but you can see the authorities there going into the dirt. They've returned to this area, Khan Yunis, in actually southern Gaza, where Israel finally has left. The Israeli military has finally left that area. They had said originally that's where you should go. You'll be safe there. Move south. Get away from the area closest to the Israeli border in the northeast. Move south, southwest, where Al Shifa Hospital is, where Khan Yunis is, where Rafah refugee camp is. And nevertheless, despite the exhortations by Israel to the Gazans, you'll be safe in the south, obviously not the case. Obviously not the case with now 392 bodies identified as human remains in these mass graves. Even the White House is deeply disturbed. There just isn't anyone, it seems, who can look at this without being overwrought, without being disgusted, without being sick, without being at heart harmed, hurt. I mean, it's painful, is it not? The New York Times adopting a far more dispassionate tone. UN, according to the headline here, is not mass graves found. The headline is not 392 bodies recovered, more, many not identified. Not Israel Defense Forces leave behind mass graves in their wake. Nothing like that. Just UN calls for inquiry. And it's remarkable, the passive voice as well into mass graves at 2 Gaza hospitals. So they don't even tell you who's responsible for those mass graves. We'll find out in a little bit how, again, the New York Times bends over backwards to avoid attributing the atrocities to Israel. And again, uses language that really isn't appropriate for what was found for this massacre. Mass grave, probably reflecting a massacre, but maybe several massacres where bodies were simply piled on top of each other. In the immediate caption, the immediate synopsis underneath, the New York Times presents it as a he said, she said. Palestinian officials said scores of bodies had been found. Well, they were found. I mean, it's not like they say they were found. They were found. Some shot in the head. Apparently, again, the New York Times not just accepting that as fact, even though we see the video evidence. One shot in the head, some shot in the head at a hospital. There are actually 4 sites again. Israel, but it's a he said, she said. So that's what Palestine says. Israel says it dug up and reburied some bodies in search of hostages. Everything they possibly can to minimize the scale of Israel's war crimes. That is what your New York Times is doing. And it's really important. I mean, I get we have other sources of news. We know this from Al Jazeera. We know the BBC is reporting this more accurately. But the New York Times is the go-to for millions and millions of people, and very influential people, very important people. And I mentioned yesterday, a high percentage are Jewish. And why is that so important? Well, for a variety of reasons. I mean, one is Jewish people do have disproportionate, let's face it, we as a group are disproportionately affluent. We have disproportionate influence over what our government is doing. So the fact that many Jews are being misled by the New York Times has a disproportionate impact on American policy. So that's one reason that it's really, really important. But around the world, people get their information. Many cite the New York Times. Many other reporters around the world are using the New York Times as a source. So this has a ripple effect beyond just those who read the newspaper. And it's very, very unfortunate. I think if more Jewish people also realized, and I think many are don't want to know. I mean, it's not just that we, as a group of people, are ignorant because of the New York Times. We're willfully being misled. We want we don't want to learn about exactly how bad Israel is, and the New York Times is allowing so many to wallow in ignorance of the crimes of Israel. And that is also giving Israel a bit of carte blanche. If American Jewish people began en masse, and many of us are, but perhaps not the billionaire class that supports Israel, but many of us have moved away from Israel, the more that American Jewish people stop supporting Israel, the more that we reject Israel, the more likely they'll change their policies. But the New York Times, by virtue of its pro-Israel coverage, by virtue of its demonizing the protesters at college campuses, by virtue of its refusal to use the word genocide to refer to the Palestinian people, except in rare circumstances as the Palestinian people, to not call them refugees, all of that makes it less likely that many will ultimately say no more to Israel, no mas, we can't support you anymore. So that means that this continues. So the direct result of that is this continues. New York Times does show an image, and you think, well, they're showing the image. It's like how much denial can they be? But if you look at the actual caption, again, they're playing that he said, she said game, which is very, very frustrating, and makes it harder to really. And I don't always believe people should be outraged, right? I don't think that, so-called microaggressions should always lead people to be outraged. Somebody looks at you side-eyed. You don't need to be outraged. But when you are confronted with mass graves, when you're confronted with hospital victims, people who were, in recovery, being just simply thrown, perhaps buried alive, as Al Jazeera reports, then you should be outraged. That's the time to be outraged. But the New York Times apparently is not. And you can see from this caption, I hope you can read, the Palestinian civil defense recovering by, so they acknowledge it's happening, from what the Palestinian, the civil defense is calling, what it is calling a mass grave. What would you call it? What else would you call that? A whole lot of bodies are thrown together in a big pit. What do you call that but a mass grave? Apparently, maybe Israel said, don't use the term mass grave, so they're not going to use it. Media in general, and this really reflects the isolation even here with the New York Times. And my question kind of is, if you want to answer, and I'd love to hear from you, is it time to simply cancel your subscription? I still subscribe. I get a very, very low rate. I threatened to quit, and they called me up and they gave me like $1 a week or some low price. And I was like, okay, it's worth it. There's so much information in there. Much of it is certainly credible, so I can't say it's all BS. But they also are propagandizing. So they don't, they won't, they say what Palestine is calling a mass grave. Well, no, it is a mass grave. And this little, to the extent you think, well, it's not that big a deal, Hal, why are you making so much of this? It all adds up. It all adds up. Every little detail that's shaded to kind of favor Israel, to make it look like what Israel's doing isn't that bad. It all adds up. The cumulative effect is people feel comfortable supporting Israel. They still feel, okay, it's okay. What Israel's doing is okay. Maybe they really aren't mass graves. Maybe it's simply what Hamas is telling us, and we can't believe a word they say. It's very, very disappointing. It's very troubling. We just don't have media, that's, I know it can never be unbiased, but the influences of small special interest groups so often predominate, even in what many of you believe is honest, relatively objective journalism. And it just simply isn't. So more from what you don't learn in the New York Times, what isn't highlighted by the New York Times. The discovery of those mass graves included stripped naked victims with hands tied. And this includes recovery of hundreds of bodies buried deep in the ground, covered with waste. These include older people, women, and wounded. And it's, no one's treating this story as like, well, maybe it didn't happen. Maybe it isn't true. Maybe it's being exaggerated. And that's because the Palestinian authorities have been consistently reliable. They have not exaggerated. They have not overstated the case the way Israel has consistently done, claiming that girls and women were raped when the evidence that we've finally been able to, examine shows just the opposite. But the New York Times will only question even when there's no real reason to question. There's no, there's no legitimate doubt that the reports are accurate. We'll still say, well, they say this, but the others say that. That's when it comes to evidence, facts, documenting the Israeli war crimes, Israeli genocide against Gaza. But when it's allegations by Israel, even with virtually no evidence whatsoever, they run with it. When it's evidence of allegations of anti-Semitism on college campuses, they run with it. Even when it's clear that confrontations, arguments, discussions are not based on the Jewishness of the alleged victim, but on their insistence on defending the now clearly genocidal state of Israel. The Times insists on presenting for you the Israeli Defense Forces argument. So after the UN calls for an inquiry, the Israeli military says the forces that its forces had exhumed bodies. No, we didn't mass bury them. The Palestinians did. No word why the Palestinians would have tied hands, thrown old people, thrown children into these mass graves. No, they don't explain that. They just say, oh, well, they buried them. We're just trying to find our hostages. And they only responded to the report of mass grave at Nasser Hospital, not at Al-Shifa. So the defense by the Israeli military, extremely thin, extremely weak, not comprehensive. But the New York Times chooses to provide it for you. And fair enough, you get to decide if it's credible. And I give them a little bit of credit, the Times that is, for at least following up and giving you more reason to recognize how thin, how uncredible, how not credible Israel is when it claims, oh no, we aren't responsible for those mass graves. We dug the bodies up ourselves because we were looking for our hostages. But the Times does go a little further than just simply stenographing what Israel says. They continue, the military declined to say, refused to say, couldn't say, would be terms I might use, how many bodies the troops had exhumed and reburied, how they died, and whether the remains of any hostages had been found, which is ironic because their whole argument for having dug the bodies up in the first place and buried them was they were looking for hostages, but they couldn't say that they found any. Nor did they say how they would have determined if they had found them that they were hostages. But they do say, we carried it out respectfully while maintaining the dignity of the deceased. Bodies examined which did not belong to Israeli hostages were returned to their place. I get thrown in, bodies that were, people who were tied up. It's just more BS. Just like they said, there were all these underground passageways where Hamas was hanging out in these hospitals. They had no evidence of it. And after they spent weeks and weeks digging through the rubble that they had created, they had no evidence. New York Times just will not say that. And despite their apparent skepticism, right? The military declined to say what happened at Al-Shifa, the military declined to say if it found any hostages. Despite all that, it becomes clear in the next paragraph that the New York Times actually accepts hook, line, and sinker the story. I call it despicable. I call it despicable because there is a genocide going on, and the New York Times simply will not tell you that. It will not explain that to you. It bends over backwards, I presume, because it's placating its owners, its advertisers. I don't know. But this is a moral imperative. And the paper has so much influence. If the new, I think it was famously said, I may get this quote wrong, by LBJ, I've lost Cronkite, meaning Cronkite's support for the Vietnam War. I've lost America. Now, it's interesting to me that LBJ would have said that because LBJ never liked Vietnam War anyway. Didn't want to be involved in Vietnam. Got us deeper and deeper in the war that really Kennedy deserves a lot of the blame for that he doesn't get. But pushed us deeper into the big muddy because it was kind of a payback to Democratic hawks who only agreed to vote for the civil rights legislation in 64, 65 in return for LBJ's promise to escalate in Vietnam. LBJ knowing it was wrong, knowing it was a mistake, but determining in the end that he had a moral obligation to fight and end Jim Crow if he could, notwithstanding the carnage in Southeast Asia that he knew would result, and that he knew was a terrible mistake. Famous quote, presumably by LBJ, I've lost Cronkite, I've lost America. If you lose the New York Times in support of this war, you might have lost America. That's Israel, right? If Israel sees in the New York Times genocidal acts committed by Israel, mass graves found where Israeli military was camped out, death toll at the hands of the Israeli Defense Forces reaches 34,000. If those were the headlines, then Israel might really just completely lose America. Because so much of support for Israel comes from the sort of the liberal elites who read the New York Times. That's the kind of power this newspaper has. And they won't do it. So it's reprehensible. That's why I spend the time on it. The New York Times buys the Israeli Defense Forces argument. Oh yeah, we dug them up, then we threw them back in there. It was not clear, as the New York Times says, the argument by the military, the Israeli military, that these people were in the mass grave were originally buried. We're not clear where they were. But it's the Palestinians who bury the dead in mass graves. That's where we should look. Let's find out where. Let's ask the Gazans. Where did you bury those people? Even though Israel was in complete control of the area for weeks and months beforehand. Let's find out from the Palestinians. And they say it was common for Palestinians to bury. So then they link to a story that they carried that supposedly explains those mass graves. This goes way, way, way back to November. And even if you look at this story, which is supposed to be, that the New York Times carried, supposed to be somehow explaining it's the Palestinians' responsibility for those mass graves. They don't tell you, by the way, when they say the Palestinians would bury a lot of bodies in one grave, it's the Palestinians, it's wartime exigencies. They don't tell you who killed the people, who killed them. So 100 bodies are delivered. And they don't tell you, again, it's that passive voice. 111 bodies wrapped in bright blue bags arrived in a shipping container on the back of a truck. So that's what Israel's doing. Now they show you, that's what they did. It's hardly an excuse, is it? It hardly makes you feel like, oh yeah, it's the Palestinians' fault. If you read the story, which again doesn't in the headline capture who was responsible for those dead or who delivered them in the truck, right? Oh, these bodies were just delivered in a truck. But if you read this story, you don't have to read very far. You just look at the picture. The bodies, believed to be from Al-Shifa, were returned by Israel to the Palestinian authorities. So how kind of Israel to return those bodies, people they killed. How generous. Those are not going to be the people that were just discovered in this latest grave. Those blue bags are identified. They know who they were. They went through them. Yes, they were buried in a mass grave. Now there's more. There's more. But Palestinians had no choice because they had all these. They have no other place to put them. But we're now finding yet more bodies tied up, children, and New York Times wants you to believe it's the Palestinians' fault. That's extraordinary. So why is this so important? Why does it really matter that one media outlet can get it so wrong and deliberately wrong and ignore the meaning that these are not isolated, war tragedies, deaths that we all wish didn't happen, but this is, both sides. The Palestinians did this, the Israelis say they did that. No, it really, really, really matters that the New York Times says to you, pick your choose which one you want. And basically, we're telling you to choose the Israelis. They're not occupying territories. You can't say occupied. They're not committing atrocities. We don't say atrocity. They're not committing genocide. And they're fighters against terrorists. That's what the New York Times is telling you over and over and over again. In the teeth of evidence that's absolutely to the contrary. So why does that matter? Well, I got this post. I saw this post on Facebook from a Facebook friend, somebody I actually know, who's a real friend, not just a Facebook friend, somebody I actually really know. I never out or dox people. I don't like to do that unless it's clear that they're, they know or they're good with having their view identified. But this is from 4 hours ago. I circled that or squared it. 4 hours. So right now, the New York Times is telling you about mass graves. But they're not telling you the whole story. They're not even coming close. They just simply mention it. They say, well, Israel has its own explanation. They bury the bodies respectfully and with dignity. No words like genocide. But this is all coming out in the corporate media and in independent media as well. How responsible Israel is, but not in the New York Times. So somebody who I'm absolutely certain reads the New York Times every morning, probably still gets it delivered in paper form, still can feel comfortable posting this because of the stories in the New York Times that have displaced the murders in Gaza, the atrocities in Gaza, the genocide in Gaza, the stories that displace them about alleged, unproven, evidence-free or very, very weak evidence stories about Jews being persecuted or being discriminated against on college campuses, even though they're not. And this person feels perfectly comfortable posting this meme on Facebook when it's just absurd. The Jewish students aren't alone for sure. They've got the back of everybody from Congress on down, from the president on down, from the most influential newspaper in the world. They're all on the side of those, quote, not Jewish students who support Gaza, not Jewish students who are opposed to the Holocaust there. They're the ones who are alone, apparently. But because the media isn't, or at least the New York Times, has betrayed its responsibility to present all the news that's fit to print. So many people still feel comfortable adopting a position that Israel and its supporters and its Jewish supporters are the victims. Very, very, very wrong. It's very, very unfortunate. All right, I just have one more quick story I want to get to. It's not even quick. I was taken, and this is kind of the other way around, right? I mean, I was just talking about how bad at least one incredibly important influential media outlet is when it comes to covering the most important story of our time. I saw that this, I think I saw this at Real Clear Politics, is how it came to my attention. And this guy, Professor Galloway, was on Morning Joe. And my initial take was, it's probably really bad what he has to say. Because he was, and I think I saw him on Brianna Joy Gray and Robbie Suave on The Hill Rising, talking about how we should be banning TikTok. TikTok brought it on itself. There's 52, some sort of number he came up with, 52 pro-Palestine videos for every one that's for Israel. Like that's somehow a bad thing. He was saying, oh, it's biased. It's clearly the Chinese government is trying to undermine our sovereignty with pro-Palestine videos. I mean, complete nonsense, complete absurdity. So imagine my surprise and frankly delight when I found that Professor Galloway, at least when it comes to economic justice issues, really, really gets it. He really does. And so good for you, Galloway. Let me play this. I'm going to play the whole video because I think it's incredibly, it's instructive, it's important, and there's just a lot of wisdom that I wish, that I've certainly tried to present, but I wish more media was presenting it. I do have to wonder, well, it wasn't Joe Scarborough who was hosting. It was the other, it was, I don't know. Is it Hal? Not, there was one guy who got fired because he was like a sexual, it was like a Me Too moment. And I don't know if that was Mark Halperin or not, or Halbrun or Heilbrun or something, or John Heilbrun. I don't. But this other guy is the guest host. Play the video so you can see it. There's a lot of real wisdom in this.
Her parents were at 30. That is the social compact breaking down. People aged 30 to 34, 60% of them in 1990 had one child. Now it's 27%. People are opting out of America. They're not optimistic about it. They're not having kids. Young people aren't having sex. They're not meeting. They're not mating.
So that's so true. And I think it's really unfortunate. I mean, I don't personally, but I mean, shouldn't you have fun when you're a kid? Shouldn't you get, I was talking to my son about like the people who have these dual careers. They work 2 jobs full time because you can do it remotely. I guess you can sort of logistically do it. You work 40 hours during the day and 40 hours at night. And he's like, hey, and these people are making over $200,000. I'm like, that's awful. Like, that's awful. When do you get to have fun? When do you get to socialize? When do you get to enjoy other people? You're young. You should be out there connecting emotionally, spiritually, yes, sexually. And this professor at the business school there, NYU, is saying that doesn't happen anymore. We betrayed young people. Now they're making less than their parents were. The first generation ever, he says, making less at 30 than their parents were. Now, I don't know if I believe that because, what, in 1930, are you telling me, Professor Galloway, in the depths of the Great Depression, people were better off than their parents were 30 years earlier? I'm not buying that one. I'm not accepting that. 25 years earlier, right? I'm not accepting that one. But I think it's fair to say that people now are noticeably, this generation is noticeably having to work harder and harder and harder to maybe stay in place or more likely fall behind. In the Great Depression, people fell behind because they didn't even have jobs. Now you may have a job, but your pay doesn't cover your expenses. That's why, my son's like, oh, well, these kids are making $200,000, $300,000 a year because they're working 2 jobs. They each get $150,000 each. I'm like, what are you, out of your mind? That sounds like an absolutely hellacious life. But he doesn't get it. That's the new normal.
The pool of emotionally and economically viable men shrinks every day, which lessens household formation. So we have a real issue. Young people are enraged. So it turns every cut, every movement into an opportunistic infection because, quite frankly, they are just...
We're saying that we're sick. He's saying every cut, every movement, meaning the society itself is sick. It's infected. It's infected. And he's right. There's no question.
Pissed off. They look up, they see wealth, exceptional wealth across my generation and people in certain industries, and they are really struggling. Their purchasing power is going down, and the incumbents create artificial scarcity on campus. We take pride in rejecting 90% of our applicants.
This is so true. Also, like the whole college admission process is so unbelievably corrupt. I think this Duke admissions counselor said, I started to feel really guilty because I'd go to these college days, right, at high schools and meet with kids who really want to go to Duke. Oh, I love to go to Duke, but I have a B average. I had a combined 1150 on my SATs. Is it worth applying? That doesn't get me in, right? And the counselor's like, oh no, go ahead. You never know. We always accept a few people with that kind of credentials. And what he doesn't tell you is, if they can dunk a basketball with both hands. What he doesn't tell you is if they're like a first violinist. So the goal of these college admission counselors isn't to give solid, legitimate advice to kids and not have them apply when they're not going to get in and not spend the money because you have to pay for those applications. But no, we just want to maximize the number of people that we reject. That's the goal of the colleges today. So that's what he's saying. 90% don't get in. So people are like, we can't even get into these schools. And our chance to become comfortable, economically secure, more than that. And, of course, people are constantly being exhorted. You got to make more money. You got to get rich. But today, many can barely even stay middle class.
So the incumbents who already have a degree see their degree go up in value. We get very concerned with housing and traffic once we own a housing. Housing permits are sequestered from young people. Housing prices have gone from $290 to $420 in the last 4 years. So a young person, a house, stocks that I don't own skyrocket in value. Let's have COVID relief and flush the markets and take assets way up because if 1 million people dying would be bad, it would be tragic if I got less wealthy.
So that's an incredible statement, right? What this guy is saying is, and I want to repeat that. He's saying that the elites, the decision makers, are sacrificing people by the millions so they won't get less wealth. So that the few at the very top, the ones who make the decisions, won't get less wealth.
And take assets way up because if 1 million people dying would be bad, it would be tragic if I got less wealthy. And we're doing it on their credit card. Young people have every reason to be enraged, and every issue they see, they look up, they get angry, and they see someone doing better than them. And then every day it is speedballed in their face that they are failing, that they are not doing as well as everyone around them.
So it's true. It's not also, we don't have a society, there's no social compact where we're sort of all feel we're in it together, right? Like he just said, it's speedballed in your face. You're not making enough. You're not successful. You're not doing well. This is so correctly describing America today. And I had said one of the kind of cures, the ultimate cures, we have to reduce wealth and income inequality. There has to be a massive effort to rein in the outsized salaries, the outsized inheritances that a few command and that no one else can come close to. We have to address that. But I also agree, and we talked about this on another program, we need some sort of a national goal, something where we have something that's beyond ourselves. And I know it was mentioned going to the moon, right? Going to space. I don't love that goal for a lot of reasons. But if we have goals like making sure that everyone has a home, right? Making sure that, fighting for peace, to have real peace and justice around the world. Those kind of goals, I think, would bring a certain degree of joy and a certain degree of purpose and meaning into lives that right now have just evolved into a soulless drive for wealth and accumulation. Also, just by way of this, I would, and I may get this up on, since we got a couple extra minutes, try to show you a little meme I responded to on the Halitics Facebook page, which I hope you'll check out if you haven't yet. Go to the Halitics group on Facebook. It is open to anyone who accesses it, and we have spirited discussions. I think it's very useful. I like it a lot. I think that we don't have the conversations I'd like yet on Halitics, the live stream, but we have some of those on Halitics, the Facebook page. So that's gratifying to me. I'd like you to check it out if you got a chance, because I think there's a real interesting post about this is from Earl, a real interesting post about whites being afraid of black people, and my response to that. And I may or may not get to that. I think I'll try to do that today if we have minutes. But I also just hope, you'll subscribe. So that would be very cool as well. Subscribe button with the bell bottom right of your screen. Let's get the rest of this video in from Professor Galloway.
We have lost the script. Our kids are more anxious and more depressed and more obese and more addicted. And we have made a purposeful decision to let this happen by ensuring the people around this table stay wealthy at the cost of young people.
That's just an amazing statement. He indicts, Galloway does, he absolutely indicts. He says the people at this table, he's saying we have made a conscious decision. We're going to enrich ourselves. We're going to take a bigger and bigger portion of the pie and leave less and less for the next generation. And that's why they're bitter, they're angry, they're resentful. This is not arguable. This is exactly what's happened. It doesn't matter whether it's a Democrat or a Republican office. We have seen this dynamic playing out since at least the 1970s, or well, since the 1970s, because under, before Nixon, we had a war on poverty. We did have 90% tax, well, 70%, 90% until JFK, who lowered it to 70% until Reagan. But there was a war on poverty, and when the Johnson administration ended, Nixon continued some of the decent social policies that, had some decent social policies, but went all in on Vietnam, which was terrible. And we've seen our wealth and, our middle class shrink and economic security diminished. And that's been going on for over 50 years. And there's just no way you can dispute that. I mean, that's just the way it is, and it's terrible. I did want to show this real quick from, I said Earl, his name is Leonard Earl. He posts quite a bit at Halitics, and I really do appreciate that, Leonard. Thank you for doing that. And I did respond. We'll show my response in a moment. And it's sort of a weird. So I don't dispute what he writes. It's time Africans know the truth, we fear black people. Let me see. Position. I had a little bit of a issue with my OBS studio lately. I guess I have to update it, so I'm sorry about that. Let me just go back to just how. Let's see if this works. Yeah, for some reason the slide deck is struggling a little bit. It doesn't want to show. So I guess we'll, in any event, the meme shows white lawyer brutally exposed to the secrets and insecurities about his race in a viral video. So I commented that disproportionate why whites fear blacks, because I don't disagree with that, but I added a disproportionate amount of street crime, which is what people tend to fear most, is committed by African Americans. When you couple that fact with our innate tribalism, right, we naturally, biologically fear the other, it is no wonder that whites and other groups fear young black men who, because young men are generally the ones who commit crimes more than any other group, especially violent crimes, street crimes, the ones we fear, and people who are economically insecure are more likely to commit crimes. Again, it is no wonder that whites and other groups fear young black men. So what's the remedy? And I found a site, and I don't know if I'll be able to show this to you because like I said, there's a little bit of a problem. Maybe I just need to update OBS Studio. I'm not really clear on that. But that said, the way you address this problem is you reduce wealth and income inequality, right? I mean, is it any surprise that people who have very few prospects, who are surrounded by people, you just heard from Galway, who are making more money, who make money, who are doing well, or at least appear to be doing well, the way you respond to that is you just make sure they have enough, that everyone has enough, and no one has too much. It's just, it isn't that hard. It really, and you know why it's that hard? Because you heard what Galloway said. The people at the top, and we're all greedy. I mean, let's face it, that's part of the human condition too. But we've somehow let these greedy, wealthy bastards make all the decisions, and the decisions they make are great for them in the short run. I think in the long run, they're bad for all of us. But in the short run, they've been very good for these few at the top, and they are just simply, not sharing. And you can say, well, that's because they earned it somehow. They earned it. Okay, that's fine. They earned it. You want to say they earned it, then say they earned it. Whatever. Whether you earned it or not, you still have an obligation to everyone else in society. You still have a duty to make sure that no one's sleeping under bridges and no one's begging in the streets. And that duty seems to have completely disappeared. That recognition is gone. And I have no idea how, why, what we can do about it. That's why I do this live stream. It doesn't seem to have really changed. But what from libertyfund.org has to say about street crime. Black Americans are possibly committing relatively more crimes because of facing higher economic insecurities and limited economic opportunities. This is plausible. If it is more difficult for a black man or woman to obtain legal work and income engaging in illegal activity, robbery, theft, burglary, becomes a lower cost alternative. If you are afraid of African Americans, if you bemoan the fact that there's fear of some blacks, especially younger black men, if that's something that upsets you, that you wish weren't the case, then make sure that everyone has enough and no one has too much. That's going to do it for me today. I hope you have a great afternoon or morning. If it's still morning where you are, I will be back tomorrow with the free-for-all.